Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and you're watching Redlines. As a popular uprising has swept the United States, spurred in response to the police murder of an unarmed black man, George Floyd, in Minneapolis, a new phenomenon has curiously caught on among cops around the country. They're taking a knee. No, not on the necks of innocent civilians this time, but supposedly in a show of solidarity with peaceful demonstrators. News reports nationwide have broadcast images of cops kneeling amidst the very crowds gathered to protest their increased militarization and abuse of power, as if staged to make us all feel warm inside and remind us that the police are on our side. In Minneapolis, even the National Guard got in on the action.
I'm sorry for your loss as a citizen of Minnesota. I'm sorry for the loss of George Floyd. All right, my heart hurts as a human being. Last night when I talked to the group out here who peacefully assembled, they peacefully assembled here to have their voice heard. And what we're asking tonight is for the same thing. One of the things that the crowd asked for last night was to have the officers and the army removed, right? So we're off. So for the men and women and children that came out last night to have their voices heard, we heard it, and we're gonna stay back behind invisible so that you can't see us. Is that okay?
For those of us with actual experience covering police killings and public outrage, these take-a-knee actions were clearly nothing more than a coordinated PR campaign. Don't believe me? Consider the fact that the same police department in Buffalo, New York, which was photographed taking a knee on June 3rd, was responsible for this incident just one day later. Those cops shoved a 75-year-old peace activist to the ground and let his head bleed out in the same exact location where they'd taken a knee just 24 hours before. Those of us in the media who leap to share images of police doing good deeds unquestioningly are merely doing the cops' public relations job for them. Most absurd was a video recorded in Flint, Michigan, which people claimed actually showed a sheriff and his police department laying down their batons and joining the demonstrations.
We want to be with y'all for real. So I took my helmet off and laid the batons down.
Yeah.
I want to make this a parade, not a protest. You got little ones here, you got dogs, so what's up? So listen, I'm just telling you, these cops love you. That cop over there hugs people.
Parade, not a protest? His words said it all. That stunt was not about joining the protests. It was about co-opting resistance and winning international headlines, casting the police in a positive light. To learn more about COPAGANDA, as well as the true records of police officers gaining national praise, such as Sheriff Swanson, I spoke earlier with Alec Karakastanis, the founder and executive director of Civil Rights Corps and the author of Usual Cruelty, The Complicity of Lawyers in the Criminal Justice System. Alec Karakastanis, founder and executive director of Civil Rights Corps and author of Usual Cruelty. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start just by asking you, who exactly is Sheriff Chris Swanson, and what was your reaction to seeing him win so much positive media attention for joining the protests? That's the way international media framed his actions in Flint, Michigan.
So Sheriff Swanson is the sheriff of Genesee County, Michigan, which is the metro area around Flint, Michigan. And I was surprised, honestly, to see all of the positive press that he's gotten, given the kinds of activities he's engaged in every single day. So Sheriff Swanson's jail is packed disproportionately with Black people. Almost all of them are confined in his jail just because they can't pay cash bail. That means he would let them out of jail back to their homes and families and schools and churches and jobs and communities if only they had enough cash to pay for their own release. And while these people are confined in his jail, Swanson has been running a scheme with a large corporation, global TEL-LINK, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, this corporation, its entire business model is to profit off of the separation of disproportionately Black families. So Swanson has been working with this company to create a scheme to profit off of the people in his jail. He gets money for every phone call and video call that people in the jail make under this contract to their families. And at the same time as this contract was signed a few years ago, first with another company, a multi-billion-dollar company called Securus, which is actually owned by the Detroit Pistons owner, billionaire. Swanson inserted into this contract provisions that paid him tens of thousands of dollars a year into the budget of the sheriff and the county, and gave them extra money for every phone and video call that people wanted to pay to keep in touch with their loved ones. And around the same time, Swanson's office canceled all in-person visits with people and their families. So you now have to pay if you want to see and talk to your family. You can no longer hug your child or visit with your family for free. You have to pay Swanson and this company if you want to communicate with their families. And this is the kind of everyday violence and family separation that is what Swanson does, and it is who he is. And so I found it fascinating that he could get such positive press just for a few photo ops and platitudes that he uttered in the middle of a protest about police brutality against Black bodies.
Yeah, and he said things like, these cops love you. This cop over here hugs people. He actually said that he wanted to turn the protest into a parade. That was a phrase that I found so interesting because it kind of suggested almost that it wasn't the police joining the protest, it was them co-opting a demonstration. I was wondering what you thought about that.
I was struck by it in particular because it's not an outlier. You know, Swanson is part of a coordinated effort of hundreds of police leaders across the country now engaged in what I think of as a propaganda war. It's a battle over our image of who the police are and what they do. Are they a force full of good cops who are trying their best to create community well-being and flourishing, or are they an institution designed to and throughout the last several hundred years to promote white supremacy, to protect white wealth, to cage and surveil and punish? I mean, this is a country that is now caging people at 5 times its own historical average since 1980, when we've seen the police bureaucracy explode. And you have to put some of these comments in that broader context. I mean, no other country in the recorded history of the modern world has tried to cage this many people. Police put metal chains on the bodies of 12 million people every single year in this country and process them through a really grotesque and brutal bureaucracy. People's bodies are brutalized. They're confined in jail cells all over the country that are filled with mold and mucus and blood and feces and urine. And they're left in solitary confinement. They're denied basic medical care. They're sexually assaulted in astronomical rates. And this is the reality of what the police are doing in our society. And so I think it's very interesting that there's a coordinated effort among police like Swanson to co-opt the narrative of the protests, to paint themselves as good cops who care and even, in his words, love the community. And these are the same human beings that they are brutalizing every single day with tactics that have no empirical evidence of any connection to any increased public safety, well-being, or public health.
You discussed how Sheriff Swanson actually receives kickbacks, money, based on the phone calls and video calls made into his jails. This is all by design. They've canceled in-person visits. Is any of this legal? This is something that you say actually is not unique to Swanson. It's something that sheriffs around the country are doing. How is that possible?
This is a problem that is happening in the vast majority of the 6,000 or so jails, prisons, and child detention centers and immigrant detention centers all over this country. This is a multi-billion-dollar a year prison and jail telecom industry. And one of the key points of their business model in the last few years is convincing police and sheriffs and jailers and other bureaucrats in local and county governments that they can actually profit off of this family separation. I think it's illegal and unconstitutional to deny people the right to hug their child, to talk to their family, if they can't afford to pay the county government and the city government and a private corporation owned by billionaires and private equity firms a certain amount of money. It's actually something that hasn't really been litigated very much. It's something that a lot of people are looking into, but it is ubiquitous across the country. And so I think it's very important that in talking about Swanson, we don't think of him as some kind of unique hypocrite. We think of him as the face of modern American policing. It is someone who with every fiber of their being and every moment of every day is brutalizing people, caging them because they can't pay, and then profiting off of that human caging when they want to talk to their family, and then saying in public that they love people who are protesting police brutality. That is the narrative battle that police are engaged in. If we're not careful, I think they're going to win it again, and they've been winning it every single time that we've seen this kind of violence over the last few years. At the end of the day, police budgets have increased, and more resources have flowed to police officers because of this narrative that most of these cops are good cops doing really good things for the community. And if we just give them a little bit more resources, they can ferret out the bad cops and everything will be well.
Another individual officer I've been seeing getting a lot of attention. I was watching NBC last night, and one of their interviews right off the top of the primetime hour with Lester Holt was with Houston Police Chief Art Acevedo. I'm not sure exactly how to say his last name. I think that's it. But this is another character who's kind of emerged on the actually a little bit of the international stage, because these cops are getting attention, but especially on the national stage. I'm wondering if you can tell me more about him.
So Acevedo is another great example. I mean, Acevedo controls almost $1 billion, it's almost $950 million annual police budget just in the city of Houston. That's really amazing, actually, because the city of Houston is just one of about 62 different police agencies that I can count, give or take, in the Houston metro area, including the Harris County Sheriff's Office, which has a budget of $561 million. So we're talking about a couple of $1 billion a year spent on policing just in the Houston metro area. And Acevedo has brutally used this budget to ramp up the militarization of his police, to engage in unconstitutional policing tactics all over the community, including things like illegal search warrant raids, stop and frisk, excessive force. For example, just last year, two of Acevedo's officers murdered two people in a fraudulent search warrant raid of a home and then tried to cover it up. Acevedo himself recently, while talking a good game about police brutality, has refused to even release the videos in 6 police-involved shootings that occurred over a 6-week period, the last of which came on the same day that George Floyd was killed. In the realm that I've been working in a lot, which is changing the Harris County cash bail system, when we started bringing a civil rights lawsuit in Houston around the cash bail system, there were about 20,000 human beings detained every single year in the Harris County jail just because they were too poor to pay cash bail. We won that case in court. We've transformed the cash bail system for misdemeanors in Harris County. Now we're working on doing the same in the felony system. And Acevedo has been one of the most vocal opponents of this reform. He wants to keep people in jail just because they can't pay cash bail. And he's been on Twitter and the local media and the newspapers, local television, any platform he can get. And he's spewing routinely falsehoods about the cash bail system, very reminiscent of the kinds of tactics that we saw decades ago with Willie Horton. I mean, Acevedo is seizing on irrelevant and wrong details, is linking them to create a narrative that the community will be safer with cash bail, which is just divorced from reality. And so it's fascinating for me to see someone who is such a proponent of mass human caging, whose actions are serving to increase the number of people in jail in Houston. There's now about 8,500 people in jail just in downtown Houston alone. And he's also trying to increase the profits of the for-profit commercial money bail industry. So it's fascinating to see someone like that going on national TV and getting praise for his actions in the wake of these protests.
You mentioned how Sheriff Swanson, Police Chief Acevedo are part of a coordinated effort on behalf of police departments right now across the country to engage in a propaganda war. One of the images we've seen emerge out of multiple departments is the phenomenon of officers taking a knee and supposedly showing solidarity with the demonstrations by taking that action. Some characterize all of this as COPAGANDA. I'm wondering if you can give a kind of definitive description of what that word means, and also your reaction to the Take a Knee protests cops are engaging in nationwide.
I think the police understand that if most people understood what they do with the vast bulk of their resources, there would be almost no support for the police in this country. So we have to remember that the police are existing in the context of an American society now that is caging Black people at a rate 6 times that of South Africa at the height of apartheid. And in order to get the population to buy into that, to not only buy into it, but to every single year keep increasing your budget, you have to tell some stories about what you're doing. And one of the most prominent stories that police are telling is that they mostly care about us. There's a few bad apples among us, but don't pay attention to them. If you give us enough money, we can root those out. And the core of what police do is good. And that story is just false. And so I do think of it as propaganda. I mean, 95% of all police arrests in this country are for what the FBI calls nonviolent crimes. We're sold this story that we need the police to handle violence. Now, even for violent crime, there's no shred of evidence that policing and punishment in cages and prisons is the way to deal with crime that is the result of trauma and poverty and mental illness and addiction. So even leaving that aside, the vast bulk of what police do is something else. It's caging people for possessing substances that are on a list of substances you can't possess. It's caging people who don't have a home to live in and who are living on the street. The number one charge in many jurisdictions around the country is driving on a suspended license. And 40% of all suspended licenses in this country, about 13 million driver's licenses, are suspended not for driving or safety reasons, but because the person is too poor to pay debt. And these are the kinds of realities that police want to conceal from us, because they want to conceal that they are not some kind of objective law enforcement. They're only enforcing some laws against some people some of the time. And this propaganda battle is really a battle for the moral priorities that our society has when it decides to invest tens of billions of dollars in a police bureaucracy and not to invest in things like public health and well-being and community flourishing and things like the arts and athletics for kids in the Houston area, just to take one example, or a medical clinic or addiction treatment, and all of the things that we're not investing in any significant way in our society, like affordable housing, et cetera. The police need to create these stories so they can justify this extraordinary expenditure of resources on themselves.
Alec, a lot of times when I question the images, such as police officers taking a knee, or questioned, for example, the video of Sheriff Swanson joining demonstrations, people will reply to me and comment, "Oh, Anya, you just think that cops can't do anything good. Is it possible for them to do something worthy of praise?" And what I start to think about is, well, it is true. I think under this current system, we do have to acknowledge that there really is no space to just hand a cop a cookie because he does something like say he loves the people. I don't know. It seems like we need to demand something more substantial from not only these officers, but from our elected leaders. So I'm wondering, what is your solution? What is your vision to actually change that? And so we can start to think about the way police departments operate differently.
Your theory for what the core of the problem is will obviously affect the solution that you propose. So if you think that the problem is American policing for several hundred years has just been this really great endeavor that's had a few bad apples here and there, and yes, they've lynched thousands of people, and yes, they've brutalized people, and they've created the largest punishment bureaucracy in the history of the modern world. But all in all, that was just the activity of a few bad cops. A few bad cops are the ones that created the cash bail system in this country that keeps 400,000 human beings in jail every single night. And it's a few bad cops that created the stop and frisk system in New York. If that's your view, then the kinds of solutions that you're hearing in the media, like we should get the cops to just a few more resources so they can attach body cameras, so we can watch them going into the same communities, arresting the same people, surveilling the same communities over and over again. You might think that we might want to tweak their policies a little bit so they can have slightly better written policies. That's one way of going. And another way of thinking about it is there is a structural function of police, and that structural function is to promote white supremacy and to preserve certain distributions of wealth and power in our society. They are the people that if I own a piece of land, even if 100 years ago that land was stolen from another family, let's say a black family, now, if I want to keep someone who doesn't have a house off of my property, I can call the force and the violence of the police state to come and protect it. And if you think of that's the function of police. The function of police is to cage disproportionately black people, brown people all over this country. Then you might have a different theory for what to do to end that cycle of violence. And I fall in more of the latter camp. I think if you look at the history of American police, which evolved from slave patrols in the South and in the North, evolved from forces that employers and corporations would call in to break strikes and to crush the labor movement. If you see that history, there's a through line to what police are doing today, and the only solution is to dramatically divest from police and invest in the kinds of things that the empirical evidence shows communities need for their health and well-being and safety. And from my perspective, no politician who's serious about actually ending this violence against black bodies is going to propose more resources for the police. Anyone who's serious about this is going to propose divesting from the police and investing in the kinds of things that actually can lead to our communities flourishing.
And one of the things that makes that very difficult around the country is the power police unions and police departments wield. They really operate independently of the elected government. I know from, for example, covering the uprising in Baltimore, that politicians will really make the excuse that they feel as though their hands are tied by these very powerful police unions, and really these institutions which function almost like as a gang in these cities. So how do you think we can confront that?
As always, I think that the only real solution is to organize. And it's about building a movement that changes the way we think about mass human caging, that changes the way that we think about the role of police in our society, and that builds relationships led by people who are directly impacted by police violence to change that narrative and to build the power that we're going to need to confront the police unions. As you say, they're the most powerful political force all over the country. It's not an accident that the Minneapolis mayor, Jacob Frey, is willing now to say platitudes about the killing of George Floyd. He's willing to even call for the arrest and prosecution of the cop who murdered George Floyd. At the same time, several months ago, he was ruthlessly using his own political power to push the police union objectives and to increase funding for the police and to increase the number of police officers in Minneapolis. And that is because of the political power that police unions exercise, in particular over the Democratic Party in most major American jurisdictions. And so the solution for me, as with the solution to all of the problems that are plaguing our communities, is for people to organize. And for people to organize around a radical set of principles that is developed by the people who are most directly impacted by these systems.
And the demonstrations right now, finally, I just want to end on this note, are very spontaneous around the country and really, I think, responding to a combination of things. George Floyd has come to represent the symbol of police brutality, but also there's a real unprecedented moment we're experiencing in this country regarding the economy. People are really frustrated. I don't think I've never experienced anything like this in my lifetime. So how do we harness this spontaneous energy in the streets into more organization and into a movement like the one you're describing?
I mean, I think that's the really hard work that organizers who are leading this fight, not like me, are going to have to really do. And that's the work that we all need to be supporting and focused on. Lawyers like me can play a very small role in that, perhaps, and helping to draw some attention to these issues and support some of that work. But really, it's a matter of being very clear and developing a very clear set of principles, and then building the kinds of relationships that are actually needed to push those principles in the face of adversaries who are incredibly powerful. And so I don't personally have, the answers to exactly what that will look like, but I'm looking very much forward to supporting the people that are going to be doing that work, and particular the people whose bodies and lives and minds and families and communities are most on the line right now.
I look forward to that as well. Alec Karakastanis, founder and executive director of Civil Rights Corps, also author of the book Usual Cruelty. Thanks again so much.
Thank you for having me.